Good morning, everyone. My name is ARPAN BANERJEE. I am a doctoral fellow at the Department of East Asian Studies, University of Delhi, and academic counselor here at IGNOU. And today we will begin the paper, the code of which is BPSC 133, Comparative Government and Politics. So in this paper, that is Comparative Government and Politics, today we shall be discussing the first block, which is introduction, and this block, it consists of two units. Unit 1, that is comparative analysis, nature, scope and utility, and unit 2, which is methods of comparative political analysis. Moving on, in the second block of this paper, we have comparing regimes. So in that we have two units. Authoritarian and democratic regimes is the third unit, and civilian and military regimes is the fourth unit of this second block. And moving on, in the third block, which is pertaining to the forms of government, we have two units. Unit 5, that is parliamentary and presidential systems, and unit 6, that is federal and unitary systems. And in the fourth block, which is patterns of political participation and representation, we have three units. Unit 7, that is political parties and party systems, and unit 8, that is pressure groups. Also we have unit 9 in the fourth block, which is pertaining to the electoral processes. So after that, we have the fifth and the last block of this paper, that is pertaining to the state in contemporary perspective. In that, we have a total of 4 units in the last block, which is state in contemporary perspective. So it consists of unit 10, that is state in developed and developing countries. Unit 11, that is pertaining to the state civil society relations. Unit 12, which is pertaining to state in the era of globalization. And finally unit 13, pertaining to contemporary debates on the nature of state. So let us begin with the first block and the first unit, that is comparative analysis, nature, scope and utility. So comparative study of politics, it's about comparing political phenomena. The primary goal of comparative politics is to encompass the major political similarities and differences between countries around the world. The emphasis is on how different societies cope with various problems by making comparison with others. Although comparative methods and methods of comparisons are widely used in other disciplines as well, like psychology, sociology, economics, etc., it is the substance of comparative politics, that is, its subject matter, vocabulary, perspective, and concepts, which gives comparative politics its distinctiveness, both as a method and as a subfield of the study of comparative politics. So the nature and scope of comparative politics has been determined historically by the changes in, first, the subject matter, second, the vocabulary and the political perspective. So to understand where, why and how these changes took place, we have to look at what is the focus of study at a particular historical period. What are the tools, languages or concepts that are being used for the study, and what is the vantage point, perspective and purpose of inquiry. Thus, in the sections which follow, which we will be discussing today, we shall look at the manner in which comparative politics has evolved, the continuities and discontinuities which have informed this evolution, the ways in which this evolution has been determined in and by the specific historical contexts and socio-economic and political forces, and how in the context of late 20th century, in the context of globalization, radical changes have been brought about in the manner in which the field of comparative politics has so far been envisaged. So if we discuss about the nature and scope of comparative study of politics, as we saw, the comparative method is commonly used in other disciplines as well. And that what distinguishes comparative politics from other disciplines, which also use comparative methods, is its specific subject matter, language, and perspective. In that case, one may well ask the question, is there at all a distinct field of comparative politics, political analysis, or is it a sub-discipline subsumed within the larger discipline of political science? So the three aspects of subject matter, language, vocabulary, and perspective, we must remember, are inadequate in establishing the distinctiveness of comparative politics within the broad discipline of political science, largely because comparative politics shares the subject matter and concerns of political science, that is, democracy, constitutions, political parties, social movements, etc. So within the discipline of political science, thus, the specificity of comparative political analysis is marked out by its conscious use of the comparative method to answer questions which might be of general interest to political scientists. Now, if we talk about the identification of relationships while making comparisons, this stress on the comparative method as defining the character and scope of comparative political analysis has been maintained by some scholars in order to dispel frequent misconceptions about comparative politics as involving the study of foreign countries. So, under such an understanding, if you are studying a country other than your own, example, an American studying the politics of Brazil or an Indian studying that of Sri Lanka, you would be called a comparativist. More often than not, this misconception implies merely the gathering of information about individual countries with little or at the most implicit comparison involved. The distinctiveness of comparative politics, most comparativists would argue, lies in a conscious and systematic use of comparisons to study two or more countries and with the purpose of identifying and eventually explaining differences or similarities between them with respect to the particular phenomena being analyzed. So for a long time, comparative politics appeared merely to look for similarities and differences and directed this towards classifying, dichotomizing, and polarizing political phenomena. So comparative political analysis is, however, not simply about identifying similarities and differences. The purpose of using comparisons, it is felt by several scholars, is going beyond identifying similarities and differences or to compare, or it is beyond the compare and contrast approach. The purpose is to ultimately study political phenomena in a larger framework of relationships. This, it is felt, would help deepen our understanding and broaden the levels of answering and explaining political phenomena. Now, if we talk about comparative politics and comparative government, the often encountered notion that comparative politics involves a study of governments arises, asserts Ronald Chilcott, from conceptual confusion. Unlike comparative government, whose field is limited to comparative study of governments, comparative politics is concerned with the study of all forms of political activity, governmental as well as non-governmental. The field of comparative politics has an all-encompassing nature, and comparative politics specialists tend to view it as the study of everything political. Any lesser conception of comparative politics would obscure the criteria for the selection and exclusion of what may be studied under this field. It may, however, be pointed out that for long, comparative politics concerned itself with the study of governments and regime types and confined itself to studying Western countries. The process of decolonization, especially in the wake of the Second World War, generated interest in the study of new nations. The increase in numbers and diversity of units or cases that could be brought into the gamut of comparison was accompanied also by the urge to formulate abstract universal models which could explain political phenomena in all the units. So at around this time, along with the increase and diversification of cases to be studied, there was also an expansion in the sphere of politics, so as to allow the examination of politics as a total system, including not merely the state and its institutions, but also individuals, social groupings, political parties, interest groups, social movements, etc. So certain aspects of institutions uh, and political processes were especially in focus for what was seen as their usefulness in explaining political processes. Example: political socialization, patterns of political culture, techniques of interest articulation and interest aggregation, styles of political recruitment, uh, the techniques of interest articulation and interest aggregation, styles of political recruitment, then extent of political efficacy, uh, and political apathy of the ruling elites, etc. So, moving on, these systemic studies were often built around the concern with nation building, that is, uh, providing a politico-cultural identity to a population. So, these were studies were concerned about providing a politico-cultural identity to a population, or state building, etc. And that is providing a institutional structure and processes for politics and modernization to initiate a process of change along the western path of development. So the presence of divergent ideological poles in world politics, the western capitalism and soviet socialism, the rejection of western imperialism by the newly liberated countries of asia and africa, the concern of these countries with maintaining their distinct identity, which was very well reflected in the rise of the non-aligned movement, and the sympathy among most countries with the socialist path of development, gradually led to the irrelevance of most modernization models for purposes of global or large level comparisons. Whereas the 50s and 60s were the period where attempts to explain political reality were made through the construction of large scale models, the 70s saw the assertion of third worldism and the rolling back of these models. Then in the 80s, we saw constriction in the level of comparison to narrow or smaller units. With globalization, however, the imperatives for large level comparisons increased and the field of comparisons has diversified with the proliferation uh, of non-state, non-governmental actors and the increased interconnections between nations with economic linkages and information technology revolution. So this can be called as complex interdependence. What uh, Joseph Nye has explained. So, talking about a historical overview of comparative politics, the nature and scope of comparative politics has varied according to the changes which have occurred historically in its subject matter. So, the subject matter of comparative politics has been determined both by the geographical space, that is, the countries or regions, which has constituted its field, as well as the dominant ideas concerning social reality and change which shaped the approaches to comparative studies, that is capitalist, socialist, mixed and indigenous. Likewise, at different historical junctures, the thrust or the primary concern of the studies kept changing. If you talk about the origins of comparative study of politics, comparative politics has long has a long intellectual pedigree going back to Aristotle and continued by the thinkers like Niccolo Machiavelli, John Locke, Max Weber, etc. In its earliest incarnation, the comparative study of politics comes to us in the form of studies done by the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle studied the constitutions of 150 states and classified them into a typology of regimes. His classification was presented in terms of both descriptive and normative categories. He not only described and classified regimes and political systems in terms of their types, for example, democracy, aristocracy, monarchy, etc., he also distinguished them on the basis of certain norms of good governance. So, on the basis of this comparison, he divided regimes into good and bad, ideal and perverted. So, these Aristotelian categories were acknowledged and taken up by Romans such as Polybius and Cicero, who considered them in formal and legalistic terms. So, concern with comparative study of regime types reappeared in the 15th century with Niccolo Machiavelli, who compared different types of principalities, hereditary, new, mixed, and ecclesiastic ones, and republics to arrive at the most successful ways to govern them. Now, if we talk about the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the preoccupation with philosophical and speculative questions concerning the good order or the ideal state and the use in the process of abstract and normative vocabulary persisted in comparative studies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was a period when liberalism was the reigning ideology and European countries enjoyed overwhelming dominance in world politics. The rest of the world of Asia, Africa, and Latin America were either European colonies or under their sphere of influence as ex-colonies. Comparative studies taken up during this period, for instance, by James Bryce in his book Modern Democracies, Herman Feiner's Theory and Practice of Modern Governments, and Carl J. Frederick's Constitutional Government and Democracy, Robert Michel's Political Parties, and Maurice Duverger's Political Parties were largely concerned with a comparative study of institutions, the distribution of power, and the relationship between the different layers of government. These studies were Eurocentric, and they were confined to the study of institutions, government, and regime types in European countries like Britain, France, and Germany. It may thus be said that these studies were in fact not genuinely comparative in the sense that they excluded from their analysis a large number of countries. Any generalization derived from a study confined to a few countries could not legitimately claim having validity for the rest of the world. It may be emphasized here that exclusion of the rest of the world was symptomatic of the dominance of Europe in world politics. All the contemporary history had Europe at its center, obliterating the rest of the world, colonized or liberated from colonization. As people without histories or whose histories were bound with and destined to follow the trajectories already followed by the advanced countries of the West. Thus, the above mentioned works manifest their rootedness in the normative values of the Western liberal democracies, which carried with it the baggage of racial and civilizational superiority and assumed the prescriptive character for the former colonies. Now, if we talk about the Second World War and after, in the 1930s, the political and economic situation of the world, it changed. So, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 brought into the world socialism as an ideology of the oppressed and as a critical alternative to Western liberalism and capitalism. With the end of World War II, A number of significant developments had taken place, including the decline of European or British hegemony, the emergence and entrenchment of US as the new hegemon in world politics and economy, and the bifurcation of the world into two ideological camps, that is, Western capitalism and Eastern socialism. So the majority of the rest of the world had, by the time the Second World War ended, liberated itself from European imperialism. For a period after decolonization, the notions of development, modernization, nation building, state building, etc., evinced a degree of legitimacy and even popularity as national slogans among the political elite of the new nations. Ideologically, however, these new nations were no longer compelled to toe the Western capitalist path of development, while socialism had its share of sympathizers among the new ruling elite of Asia, America, and Latin America. Quite a number of newly independent countries made a conscious decision to distance themselves from both power blocks, remaining non-aligned or to either. A number of them evolved their own specific path of development akin to the socialist, as in the case of Ujjama in Tanzania and the mixed economy model in India, which was blend of capitalism and socialism. It may be worth remembering that the comparative study of governments till 1940s was predominantly the study of institutions, the legal constitutional principles regulating them, and the manner in which they functioned in Western European liberal democracies. In the context of the above stated developments, a powerful critique of institutional approach emerged in the middle of 1950s. The critique had its roots in behavioralism, which had emerged as a new movement in the discipline of politics, aiming to provide scientific rigor to the discipline and develop a science of politics. Known as the behavioral movement, it was concerned with developing an inquiry which was quantitative, based on survey techniques involving the examination of empirical facts, separated from values, to provide value neutral, non prescriptive, objective observations and explanations. The behavioralists attempted to study social reality by seeking answers to questions like why people behave politically as they do, and why, as a result, political processes and systems function as they do. It is these why questions regarding differences in people's behaviors and their implications for political processes and political systems which changed the focus of comparative study from legal formal aspects of institutions. Thus, in 1955, Roy Macridis criticized the existing comparative studies for privileging formal institutions over non-formal political processes, for being descriptive rather than analytical, and case study oriented rather than genuinely comparative. So Harry Eckstein points out that the changes in the nature and scope of comparative politics in this period show sensitivity to the changing world politics, urging the need to reconceptualize the notion of politics and develop paradigms for large-scale comparisons. Rejecting the then traditional and almost exclusive emphasis on the Western world and the conceptual language which had been developed with such limited comparisons in mind, Gabriel Almond and his colleagues of the American Social Science Research Council's Committee on Comparative Politics sought to develop a theory and a methodology which could encompass and compare political systems of all kinds, that is, primitive or advanced, democratic or non-democratic, Western or non-Western. The broadening of concerns in a geographic or territorial sense was also accompanied by a broadening of the sense of politics itself, and in particular by a rejection of what was then perceived as the traditional and narrowly defined emphasis on the study of formal political institutions. The notion of politics was broadened by the emphasis on realism or politics in practice, as distinguished from mere legalism. This included in its scope the functioning of less formally structured agencies, behaviors and processes, like for example, political parties, interest groups, elections, voting behavior, attitudes, etc., with the deflection of attention from studies of formal institutions there was simultaneously a decline in the centrality of the notion of the state itself. So we had mentioned earlier that the emergence of a large number of countries on the world scene necessitated the development of frameworks which would facilitate comparisons on a large scale. This led to the emergence of inclusive and abstract notions like the political system. This notion of the system replaced the notion of the state and enabled scholars to take into account the extra legal, social, and cultural institutions which were critical to the understanding of non Western politics and had the added advantage of including in its scope pre state and non state societies, uh, as well as roles and offices which were not seen as overtly connected with the state. Also, with the change of emphasis to actual practices and functions of institutions, the problems of research came to be defined not in terms of what legal powers these institutions had, but what they actually did, how they were related to one another, and what roles they played in the making and execution of public policy. This led to the emergence of structural functionalism approach, in which certain functions were described as being necessary to all societies, and the execution and performance of these functions were then compared across a variety of different formal and informal structures. When the universal frameworks of systems and structural structures functions enabled Western scholars to study a wide range of political systems, structures, and behaviors within a single paradigm, the appearance of new nations provided to Western comparativists an opportunity to study what they perceived as economic and political change. So, Viarda points out that it was in this period of the 60s that most contemporary scholars of comparative politics came of age. The new nations became, for most of these scholars, ironically living laboratories for the study of social and political change. Viada describes those exciting times which offered unique opportunities to study political change and saw the development of new methodologies and approaches to study them. It was during this period that some of the most innovative and exciting theoretical and conceptual approaches were advanced in the field of comparative politics, that is, study of political culture, political socialization, developmentalism, dependency and interdependency, corporatism, bureaucratic authoritarianism, and later transitions to democracy, etc. This period saw the mushrooming of universalistic models like David Easton's political system, Carl Deutsch's social mobilization, and Edward Shill's center and periphery. The theories of modernization by Apter, Roccan, Eisenstadt, and Ward, and the theory of political development by Gabriel Almond, Coleman, Pye, and Sidney Verba also claimed universal relevance. These theories were claimed to be applicable across cultures and ideological boundaries and to explain political process everywhere. The development of comparative political analysis in this phase coincided with the international involvement of the United States of America through military alliances and foreign aid. Most study in this period was not only funded by research foundations, it was also geared to the goals of US foreign policy. The most symbolic of these were the Project Camelot in Latin America and the Himalayan Project in India. This period was heralded by the appearance of works like Apter's study on Ghana, published in 1960, Politics of Developing Areas by Gabriel Almond and Coleman, sharply defined the character of the new comparative politics movement. The publication of a new journal in the United States entitled Comparative Politics in 1969 reflected the height of this trend. Developmentalism was perhaps the dominant conceptual paradigm of this time. To a considerable extent, the interest in developmentalism emanated from US foreign policy interests in developing countries to counter the appeals of Marxism Leninism and steer them towards a non-communist way of do development. Now, if you talk about post-behavioralism, advocates of behavioral revolution who wanted to bring scientific rigor in political science were disappointed that the discipline could not anticipate or study the social and political turmoil of the times with its new environmental and feminist movements, its anti-war perspective, its civil rights concerns, etc. Their efforts to reconcile two forces, that is, making political science more rigorous and making it more relevant, led to the post-behavioral movement. So David Easton's presidential address to the American Political Studies Association in 1969 best captures this movement. David Easton outlined the credo of relevance with following 7 key points which became the hallmark of post-behavioral movement. So he said that substance must dominate over technique. What is studied matters more than how it is studied. To claim simply to study empirically politics as it exists, it lends itself to a conservative outlook as it tends to focus on what is rather than what might be. Too much sophistication in method obscures the brutal reality of much of politics and prevents political science from addressing pressing human needs. Science cannot be neutral. What you choose to study is driven by value judgments, and how that work is used should be steered by values. The role of intellectuals is to promote the humane values of civilization. To know it is to bear the responsibility to act. Scientists have a special obligation to put their knowledge to work. This commitment to engage should be institutionalized and expressed through associations of scholars and universities. They cannot stand aside. Politicization of the professions is inescapable as well as desirable. Now, if we talk about the 1970s and challenges to developmentalism, towards the 1970s, developmentalism came to be criticized for favoring abstract models, which flattened out differences among political, social, cultural systems in order to study them within a single universalistic framework. These criticisms emphasized the ethnocentrism of these models and focused on the third world in order to work out a theory of underdevelopment. They stressed the need to concentrate on solutions to the backwardness of developing countries. Two main challenges to developmentalism, which arose in the early 1970s and gained widespread attention, were: the first is dependency and the second is corporatism. Dependency theory criticized the dominant model of developmentalism for ignoring domestic class factors and international market and power factors in development. It was particularly critical of US foreign policy and multinational corporations and suggested, contrary to what was held true in developmentalism, that the development of the already industrialized nations and that of the developing ones could not go together. Instead, dependency theory argued that the development of the West had come on the shoulders and at the cost of the non-West. The idea that the diffusion of capitalism promotes underdevelopment and not development in many parts of the world was embodied in Andre Gunther Frank's Capitalism and Underdevelopment in Latin America, 1967, Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, 1972, and Malcolm Caldwell's The Wealth of Some Nations, 1979. Marxist critiques of the dependency theory, however, pointed out that the nature of exploitation through surplus extraction should not be seen simply on national lines, but as part of a more complex patterns of alliances between the metropolitan bourgeois of the core or the center and the indigenous bourgeois of the periphery or satellite, as they operated in a worldwide capitalist system. The corporatist approach criticized developmentalism for its Euro-American ethnocentrism and indicated that there were alternative organic corporatist, often authoritarian ways to organize the state and state-society relations. Now, if we talk about the 1980s witnessed the return of the state. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, Still reflecting the backlash against developmentalism, a number of theories and subject matters emerged into the field of comparative politics. These included bureaucratic authoritarianism, indigenous concepts of change, transitions to democracy, the politics of structural adjustment, neoliberalism, and privatization. While some scholars saw these developments as undermining and breaking the unity of the field, which was being dominated by developmentalism, others saw them as adding healthy diversity, providing alternative approaches, and covering new subject areas. Gabriel Almond, who had argued in the late 1950s that the notion of the state should be replaced by the political system, which was adaptable to scientific inquiry, and David Easton, who undertook to construct the parameters and concepts of a political system, continued to argue well into the 1980s on the importance of political system as the core of political study. The state, however, received its share of attention in the 1960s and 1970s in the works of bureaucratic authoritarianism in Latin America, especially in Argentina, in the works of Guillermo O'Donnell, for example, Economic Modernization and Bureaucratic Authoritarianism, 1973. Ralph Miliband's The State in Capitalist Society, 1969, had also kept the interest alive, with Nikos Poulantzas' State Power Socialism and political sociologists Peter Evans, Theda Skopkol, and others bringing the state back in. Focus was sought to be restored onto the state. The late 20th century, globalization and emerging trends. So much of the development of comparative political analysis in the period 1960s to 1980s can be seen as an ever widening range of countries being included as cases, with more variables being added to the models such as policy, ideology, governing experience, and so on. With the 1980s, however, there has been a move away from general theory to emphasis on the relevance of context. In part, this tendency reflects the renewed influence of historical inquiry in the social sciences, and especially the emergence of a historical sociology which tries to understand phenomena in the very broad or holistic context within which they occur. This was said by Theda Skopkol and M. Somers. There has been a shying away from models to a more in-depth understanding of particular countries and cases where more qualitative and contextualized data can be assessed and where account can be taken of specific institutional circumstances or particular political cultures. Hence, we see a new emphasis on more culturally specific studies. For example, English-speaking countries, Islamic countries, and nationally specific countries, that is England, India, and even institutionally specific countries, India under a specific regime. While emphasis on grand systems and model building diminished, the stress on specific contexts and cultures have meant that the scale of comparisons was brought down. Comparisons at the level of smaller systems or regions, however, remained. For example, the Islamic world, Latin American countries, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, etc. Now, if we talk about the civil society and democratization approach, the disintegration of the USSR or Soviet Union brought into the currency the notion of the end of history. In his article, The End of History, 1989, which was developed later into the book The End of History and the Last Man, Francis Fukuyama argued that the history of ideas had ended with the recognition and triumph of liberal democracy as the final form of human government. The end of history thesis invoked to stress the predominance of Western liberal democracy is in a way reminiscent of the end of ideology debate of the 1950s, which emerged at the height of the Cold War. The proponents of it were scholars like Daniel Bell, and in the context of the decline of communism in the West. Western liberal scholars proposed that the economic advancement made in the industrialized societies of the West had resolved political problems, for example, issues of freedom and state power, workers' rights, etc., which are assumed to accompany industrialization. The American sociologist Daniel Bell, in particular, pointed in his work The End of Ideology on the exhaustion of political ideas in the 1950s that, in the light of this development, there was an ideological consensus or the suspension of a need for ideological differences over issues of political practice. In the early 1990s, the idea of the end of history was coupled with another phenomena of the 80s, that is globalization. Globalization refers to a set of conditions, scientific, technological, economic, and political, which have linked together the world in a manner so that occurrences in one part of the world are bound to affect or be affected by what is happening in another part. It may be pointed out that in this global world, the focal point or the center around which events move worldwide is still Western capitalism. In the context of the so-called triumph of capitalism, the approaches to the study of civil society and democratization that have gained currency give importance to civil society defined in terms of protection of individual rights to enter the modern capitalist world. There is, however, another significant trend in this approach which seeks to place questions of civil society and democratization as its primary focus. If there are, on one hand, studies conforming to the contemporary interest of Western capitalism, seeking to develop market democracy, there are also a number of studies which take into account the resurgence of people's movements seeking autonomy, right to indigenous culture, movements of tribes, Dalits, lower castes, and the women's movement and the environment movement. These movements reveal a terrain of contestation where the interests of capital are in conflict with people's rights and represent the language of change and liberation in an era of global capital. Thus, concerns with issues of identity, environment, ethnicity, gender, race, etc., have provided a new dimension to comparative political analysis. Now, if we talk about information collection and diffusion, a significant aspect and determinant of globalization has been the unprecedented developments in the field of information and communication technology, that is the internet and world wide web. This has made the production, collection, and analysis of data easier and also assured their faster and wider diffusion worldwide. These developments have not only enhanced the availability of data but also made possible the emergence of new issues and themes which extend beyond the confines of the nation state. And these new themes, in turn, form an important influential aspect of the political environment of contemporary globalized world. So the global network of social movement organizations, the global network of activists is one such significant aspect, and the diffusion of ideas of democratization is an important outcome of such networking. The Zapatista rebellion in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas used the internet and the global media to communicate their struggle for rights, social justice, and democracy. The concern with issues regarding the promotion and protection of human rights, which is dependent on the collection and dissemination of information, has similarly become pertinent in the contemporary world. Now, if we talk about the utility of comparative study of politics, the question of utility of comparative politics is concerned with its usefulness and relevance for enhancing our understanding of political reality. It seeks to know how comparative study helps us understand this reality. First and foremost, we must bear in mind that political behavior is common to all human beings and manifests itself in diverse ways and under diverse social and institutional setups all over the world. It may be said that an understanding of these related and at the same time different political behaviors and patterns is an integral part of our understanding of politics itself. A sound and comprehensive understanding would commonly take the form of comparisons. And if we talk about the comparative analysis, nature, scope, and utility, and in that, if we talk about the comparing for theoretical formulation, while comparisons form an implicit part of all our reasoning and thinking, most comparisons would argue that a comparative study of politics seeks to make comparisons consciously to arrive at conclusion which can be generalized. That is held true for a number of cases. To be able to make such generalizations with a degree of confidence, it is not sufficient to just collect information about countries. The stress in comparative politics and political analysis is on theory building and theory testing, with the countries acting as units or cases. So, the nature and scope of comparative study of politics is related to its subject matter, its field of study, the vantage point from which the study is carried out, and the purposes towards which the study is directed. Towards the end of the World War II, a number of new nations emerged on the world scene, having liberated themselves from colonial domination. So the dominance of liberalism was challenged by the emergence of communism and the powerful presence of Soviet Union on the world scene. The concern among comparativists changed at this juncture to studying the diversity of political behaviors and processes which were thrown up, however, within a single overarching framework. This led to the use of systems and structures, functions, frameworks to study political phenomena. These frameworks were used by Western scholars, particularly those in the United States, to study phenomena like developmentalism, modernization, etc., while the political elite of the newly independent countries found concepts like development, nation building, and state building attractive, in many cases they evolved their own ideological stances and chose to remain non aligned to either ideological blocks. In the late 1980s, focus on studying politics comparatively within an overarching framework of system decline and regional systemic studies assumed significance. The focus on state in these studies marked a resurgence of the study of power structures within civil society and its political forms, which had suffered a setback with the arrival of systems and structure functions into comparative politics. The petering out of Soviet Union in the same period provoked Western scholars to proclaim the end of history, marking the triumph of liberalism and capitalism. And such expressions would have us believe that there do not in fact remain differences, uncertainties, and contests which need to be explained in a comparative perspective. There is, however, another way to look at the phenomena, and a number of scholars see the resurgence of civil society in terms of challenges to global capitalism, which comes from popular movements and trade union activism throughout the world, and the globalization of capital, a significant feature of the late 1980s, which continues and makes itself manifest in technological, economic, and information linkages among the countries of the world, has also tended to influence comparativists into adopting universalistic and homogenizing expressions like transitions to democracy, the global market, and civil society, and also it is felt would help deepen our understanding and broaden the level of answering and explaining political phenomena. In other words, the most significant purpose of comparative politics is not simply to be skeptical of others, but to question our own system and beliefs in the light of new evidence and arguments. So thank you so much for joining today's class. We shall continue with the next unit in the next class.